Hello. Welcome to Jesus Stories. We're really glad that you're here spending your lunch hour with us, where we're going to spend a little time talking about a story about something Jesus did. And today's story is from John chapter 11, where, no big deal, Jesus raises a guy from the dead. So I'm excited to explore the story a little more and to get to do it in really good company. And I want you to know our company as well here. So what we're going to do is each of us share our name, the church we're attached to, where we're from, and before you logged in with us, we were laughing about our cell phones. So we're going to share how old we were when we got our first cell phone. So I'm Mary Brown, and I get to be the pastor here at First United Methodist Church in Sylva. I'm from St. Petersburg, Florida, but a proud resident of Western North Carolina since 2003. And I got my first cell phone when I was 23 years old. And it was 2001, I was in seminary, and they were becoming very popular at the time, which proved to be a trend that lasted.
Hi, my name is Alex Dutton, and I am currently serving at Cullowhee United Methodist Church as the Duke intern for the summer. But my home church is actually called Wedgwood United Methodist Church, and it is in Akron, Ohio. And I got my first cell phone when I was 10 years old. It was a flip phone, but I got it because I had to ride the bus, and my mom was nervous about me walking back and forth from the house to the bus. But
I think the flip phone gives you a little cred.
Thank you.
I think my first phone was a flip phone as well.
Oh, okay. Cool.
How about you, David?
I am David Reeves. I work at Cullowhee Methodist Church up the road. Like Mary Brown, I'm an immigrant here. I'm from Haywood County. I got my first flip phone when I was 37 years old. It came in a bag and had a battery that weighed like 25 pounds. And I'm really glad that the technology's improved a lot. Welcome to Jesus Stories.
Where today we'll not be talking about cell phones again, we hope.
Thank goodness.
But we are going to be engaging John chapter 11, and we hope that you will engage it with us. So if you have a Bible near you or just a web browser, you can open up and pull up John chapter 11. That'll help us. Alex is going to read it for us, and we'll have it on the screens. But if there's something that you find important or engaging, I know for me, marking the place in my Bible and writing it down helps me to go back to it later, and we hope that you'll be able to do that too. We also want you to interact with us. And so in the comments on Facebook or YouTube, know that we're going to be monitoring that. There is a little bit of a delay, so be patient with us. If you comment and we don't get to it for a minute, that's why. But we would love to know if you have questions or you want to reinforce something we're saying, a story that goes along with what we're talking about. We would love to have you chime in with us as we go.
If you want to complain about anything that Mary said, feel free.
Or affirm anything that David says. One of those two things. So we're going to start off with the first, I think, 16 verses of John chapter 11. Alex is going to read those for us, and then we'll dive on in.
All right, so I'll be reading from the NRSV, John chapter 11, verses 1 through 16, and it reads, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, 'Lord, he whom you love is ill.' But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.' Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, 'Let us go to Judea again.' The disciples said to him, 'Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?' Jesus answered, 'Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of the world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them. After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him."
Scene 1. So here we get the setup to the story, right? That Jesus gets word that his friend Lazarus is critically ill, mortally ill. And when Jesus gets the news, this is the intriguing part of this section of the story for me. Jesus gets the news and he decides to linger for a couple more days. And it's intriguing for me, I think, in 2 ways. One, because I am like a neurotical on-time person. And so I can't imagine getting news like this urgent, and then dilly-dallying for a while. But also, like, this is a good friend of his. Like, if I learned that a good friend of mine was critically ill, it's like a drop everything and go situation, right? So this is what I want to explore at the first, and then y'all can just take us off in a whole different direction if you want to. What do we make of this, that Jesus doesn't rush to Lazarus' side, that he chooses to wait for a couple days first?
I love watching cartoons. I always have. And I took a course in college one time where a physics course where the professor talked a lot about cartoon physics where the same rules don't apply. And I think we kind of do the same thing when we read the Bible. The normal way that people behave doesn't apply as we read these stories, and it makes us kind of easier. It makes it easier for us to digest the story without going, well, why didn't he go right? Why didn't he go right then? I guess the first question that comes to mind is they did send a message to Jesus because they were probably related, and maybe because they're really tight. They love each other a lot. They sent the message to Jesus for the same reason that you would if someone you loved a lot were very ill and someone sent you that message. It might not be that you would go and heal them miraculously. It'd be that they just want you to know. They want you to know and hopefully to be there when whatever happens. So when they sent that message, they had to, it's a gesture of affection and respect to Jesus, I think, just to say, we need you here.
That's a really good point, because I think I read it, and we know how the story ends, right? That Jesus is going to heal Lazarus. But it's safe to assume Martha, especially by their reaction when Jesus gets there, Martha and Mary don't know that. And so to think of it in different terms, that it's more like, we just want you to know what's going on. Do you think this gives permission for all those people who are always like 15 minutes late everywhere, that it's okay to be late to everything? What do you think, Alex? Alex, are you an on-time person or a late person? Are you the 15-minute late person to everything?
I mean, I want to say that I'm on time, but that would probably be lying. So I wouldn't say 15 minutes, maybe 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. I'm the kind of person that gets, your iced coffee before going into work, and that's okay because you got your iced coffee.
It's a priority.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I do. It probably says something about Jesus' priorities. He, at that moment, what he was doing was important.
Well, and he says that the purpose of it, I noticed this when Alex was reading it, that the purpose was to glorify God. Like, okay, guys, watch this. Once the disciples understand the whole asleep versus dying difference, Like, okay, guys, watch this. God's going to be glorified through this. I'm going to be glorified through this. And that's Jesus' compass. Not, for me, being on time, I want to be on time to make myself look good and to people please. Jesus is more concerned about what's going to give God glory in this.
That whole thing that you see in John over and over again, where Jesus interjects these little explanations exactly like this in a dozen or more places, is actually part of what makes John kind of hard for me. I mean, in a way, it takes a little bit of the mystery out of it. I mean, he's Jesus; he gets to do what he wants to do. But I think it would have been like, I think I'll just stop right now. Yeah, okay, good.
I think that is a really important piece of the story, though. The part where Jesus foreshadows kind of what is going to happen in the end. Because he knows what's going to happen to Lazarus while the disciples don't. And he tells the disciples, yet they still don't necessarily believe him or understand what he's saying by sleeping. But yet Jesus tells them straight up, like, Lazarus is dead, but he is going to rise again for the glory of God. And I think that's a really important piece of the story, going farther into the passage to remember.
I think that's a really good point because, like, when we know how the story ends, it decreases our anxiety even when there's a high tension point. And I always think about this watching movies with my kids. We've been watching movies in quarantine, like a lot of people, and we wanted to watch the whole Indiana Jones series. We thought this would be really great to do as a family. Like, everyone needs to watch this. But it turns out they're too stressful for my youngest to watch. And so he would turn around into the couch at a stressful point and, like, shut down. And so we're trying to explain to him, like, the movie's called Indiana Jones. This is Indiana Jones. He's not going to die. Like, he's going to make it to the end. But he can't trust that because he doesn't know how the story ends. And so when we know how the story ends, Jesus knows, then he can ride along with it. Like, everything's going to turn out okay, and I know that, even though it doesn't look like it now.
So Jesus interjects all this stuff in John, saying it's going to work out, so we don't have to worry that Reed will be upset, or, I mean, is that what?
So that we can watch movies with a low level of anxiety. But
Jesus does know that Lazarus has died. Mm-hmm. And that is important. Eventually he'll go and do something about this. Mm-hmm. But I do think there maybe it calls us to remember that in everybody's life you're occasionally called to choose between one or two or three really different important things at the same time. So he stuck with what he was doing because he needed to do that. But I think if he hadn't been really busy at that moment, he might have chosen to go a little more quickly. So.
Do we have anything else to unpack here in scene 1? Are we ready for scene 2? So no questions so far, but y'all don't forget, if you want to call us out because we're saying something you disagree with, or if you have a question to add in, or it makes you think of a story, we'd love to hear about it. Just chime in the comments.
We did have a reaction from Vivian Wisdom on the art at the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
So if you take a look here, I put on the screen, she says, awesome art, never pictured it that way.
Oh, thanks, Vivian. Yeah, so during the pre-roll, if y'all joined in with us early, we had a few pieces of art. Something I really like to do is to go to wikiart.org, and you can search for most of the stories in the Bible. There's artwork to go with it. And I always think it's really interesting to pull up not just the classical pieces of art, but then some of the modern renditions of art that go along with these pieces and what they make us think. And so you can do the same, too, if you want to kind of get this story to come to life for you a little more, to go to wikiart.org. And if you just put in Lazarus, it brings up lots of different pieces over thousands of years where people have engaged with the same story. That's kind of cool. Thanks, Vivian.
I was a big fan of the Rembrandt myself that you chose.
Oh, thanks, Duncan. Yeah, I love Rembrandt. So that's cool.
And in case you missed it, we're doing exactly what Jesus did, just hanging around doing something else instead of going to Mary and Martha, but we're going to do that pretty quick, I think.
Are we ready to move to Mary and Martha? Let's get to Mary and Martha's house. That was a good segue, David. So, Alex, you want to read the next passage for us?
All right, picking up at verse 17. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." I'm supposed to keep going. So now at 28. Thank you. Did that on purpose. When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?"
So in this passage, we get maybe one of the most quoted Bible verses. Do you remember joking? I joked about this as a kid growing up. Like if someone required you to memorize a Bible verse, John 11:35. Can you quote it, Alex?
Jesus weeps.
Jesus wept. Like 2 words. Boom.
Wept.
Depending on the translation, of course. And so, but I think this is a really intriguing part of the story. It's a very human moment for Jesus, particularly for the Gospel of John, that often tends to depict Jesus as kind of calm, cool, and collected and in control. So what do we make of this, that we're told that Jesus cries? What do you think moved him to tears?
In this story, you can see just the whole human drama. Almost every family has someone who isn't well. In this case, it was Lazarus. Mary and Martha are 2 very different people. Mary loved to be close to Jesus. She loved to talk about things theological to Jesus. She liked to sing and recite poetry. She loved people. She did all of those sort of Enneagram number 2 things. And Martha, on the other hand, was like a person who worked hard. She cooked and she cleaned and she made sure that everything was ready. And she was the person that could make a dinner happen. She's the person who could run a business. She took care of stuff. They loved each other fiercely, Mary and Martha, but they could not have been much different at all. Then Lazarus, we don't know much about. That's really kind of, I'm like, Lazarus is famous because he died, but Lazarus obviously was dear to them because they were just really torn up by this death. So when Jesus walks in on this, he's walking in on a really sad, really tense, grieving moment. The first one that he meets is Martha, and they talk. Jesus loves Martha a lot. that he has a different relationship with her than he does with Mary. A lot of the conversation there is kind of practical. They do talk a little bit about resurrection and some other stuff, but you get the feeling that Martha's just kind of like saying the words, or I kind of do, because that's what she feels like should give her hope at that moment.
That's true. Like her answers are almost kind of like Sunday school answers, like reciting, like, well, this is what people say.
Like,
yeah, I
recite
know.
me a Bible verse. Yeah. But then he calls for Mary, and Mary comes, and Mary, while Martha responds with, she deals with her grief by like taking care of all this stuff, taking care of the household. Mary is like a puddle. She's a mess. She grieves in a very visceral way. And so when Jesus and Mary come together and they talk about it, it tries to become like one of those theological conversations, but it's really just two people who are grieving and sad at that moment. They really are. In fact, Jesus is so affected that he himself cries, which is like one of my favorite things in the whole Bible.
Why is it one of your favorite things in the whole Bible?
No, you have to talk about that other thing first. That difference between the divine and the human.
Oh, yeah, the divine and human. I was going to talk about that. But it is like this balance. It's such a human moment. And for me, I love that Jesus is full with them in their grief. It's not, so we were talking about, he knows, when he's talking with the disciples earlier, he knows how the story ends, so you can kind of like decrease your anxiety. It's going to be fine. But then in this moment, he is all the way there with them. Even though he knows that he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, even though he knows it's ultimately all going to be okay, he's still all there with them in their grief. And to me, that is really meaningful to me when I am at grieving moments, when life is really hard for me, to remember that God did put on flesh 100%. Like, not that God came and was a little bit human, but all the way there, even into all the feelings and the emotions of being human, that God knows what it's like to grieve. And I think that God still does this with us, that when we are grieving, I imagine God coming in with us like John 11:35, even if it is, for silly reasons, the most quoted, maybe, Bible verse. This gives us great meaning, I think, that to imagine when we're grieving, God is coming with us again and weeping with us.
Yeah, I think this is so important to showing the humanity of Jesus. And the word that kind of sticks out to me when reading through this is compassion. While he knew what was coming, he still felt the pain that Mary and Martha were feeling. He was standing with them in that pain and was so moved to the point of tears. And I just think this is such a wonderful description of Jesus's humanity, and really just shows us the human side of Jesus along his divine side. It is such an important characteristic of Jesus that a lot of times we overlook when we're going through the stories of miracles and things like that. And I think it's just really important to knowing the character of Jesus and being able to recognize his humanity in that.
Yeah, all those things that both of you have said. I do think, though, that it also really powerfully demonstrates the divine of Jesus. I think the divine probably mourns often, because I believe that empathy is a divine notion. I think that it was Jesus Christ that cried because his pal Lazarus died. It was Jesus that cried because Mary was sad and because Martha couldn't do anything to make her grief less. I think he was deeply affected by that. And that gives me hope. Occasionally in my bad moments, I kind of wonder how much God cares about some of this stuff. And this makes me believe that God probably cares a lot about it, all of it.
All right, again, you are welcome. If you disagree, you have counter opinions, you want to ask a question, you're welcome to chime in with us in the comments. So I mentioned earlier that we've got a bit of delay here. It translates into maybe a full minute or so by the time you get to think about it and put it in. So Vivian has chimed in thinking about Jesus coming and his delay in coming, that there was danger for Jesus in Judea, and maybe that factored into his delay, which is cool. Thanks for that, Vivian. So y'all keep chiming in if you have things that you want to share with us. Anything else we want to dig into about scene 2 before we move to scene 3?
We did overlook one little tiny thing, and that's Thomas, one of Jesus' disciples.
Oh, yeah.
And evidently Thomas was always that sort of dissenter, fiercely loyal, but he was always the dissenter. He was the one that you had to prove everything to. And before they made their way over there, the last thing Thomas said is, let's go there and die with him. And I think that's what Vivian means there, that it was dangerous to travel to that town at that moment. And I'm glad, really glad for those Thomas kind of people. They're a little hard to deal with, but they'll stick with you no matter what.
Well, I think it's a beautiful comment, because I can so easily read it as being said like kind of sarcastic and snarky, like, well, let's go die too then. And yet it's what we want to say in a really serious way with our whole lives committed to being followers of Christ, is that every day what we're working toward is to be such dedicated followers of Jesus that even when where he's leading us is leading us into some kind of death, death of self, personal self-sacrifice, humility, giving to others, even when it leads into some kind of death, like, well, I'll go and die with him. That was a good one, David.
Yeah. Amen.
Scene 3?
All right, scene 3. Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go."
So as we talked about this ahead of time, I mean, what was interesting, just to try and fully imagine the reality of this. Like, this is a visceral scene. There's a stench to deal with. There, like in modern day terms, you'd be going to the cemetery and like digging up the grave again. And then Jesus comes back to the dead after 4 days. Or Lazarus comes back to the dead after 4 days. Jesus too, eventually. But so let's take a moment and try to imagine what this would have looked like. And David, I know that you've got some experience because you were an EMT before you were a pastor. You had a real job, and so you have some experience with like riding along with people who like basically enter and exit death, like have those experiences. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Clearly what you just mentioned and what happens here are two different things, but I think that the emotional response is very similar. And occasionally when on an ambulance, we would encounter a person in cardiac arrest, someone who was getting CPR because they were clinically dead. And when that happens, you continue CPR, you put a tube down to help them breathe, and you use a machine to make sure that they breathe, and then you use a defibrillator to try to get the heart where it beats in a better rhythm, and you give them a bunch of drugs. And if all of that works, then sometimes you're able to restart the heart and like end that moment a clinical death. And I don't know anyone who ever did what I did that didn't look really carefully at that moment when you first saw that little glimmer bleep of life on first a screen on a machine behind you. And when you see that, then you start looking at the person trying to see what's happening here. And that moment of just sheer like disbelief and absolute excitement, when that person like begins to wake up and starts to move a little bit, there really is nothing like it. Really is nothing like it. And sometimes you'd want to like go back to them later and ask like, what do you remember? Usually we didn't do that because we're kind of not allowed. But this part of the story has like all of the parts in it where there's grieving there. There's the real reality of death there, where you got a tomb cut into the side of a bank, covered with a stone, but that doesn't keep the smell of death away. It still sort of filters out. And then Jesus like goes just backwards of all of that, and he's like, move that stone. And Martha can't help it because like she's the person that does things like that. She's like, no, it stinks. No, like I know it's Lazarus, but we're not moving that stone. He's like, move the stone, right? And then he prays. The prayer there is awesome. It's hard for me because anybody who studies Scripture very much will know that it's also been tampered with a whole lot. Like every ancient manuscript that they encounter, it's not just a little different. It's way different. So you can tell that people have tried to retell this story in a way that kind of what they thought made sense. But way down at the end of that story, no matter how that prayer unfolds, Jesus does that remarkable thing where he just calls out in his loudest outside voice. He says, come on, Lazarus. And then what happens next? Oh, man.
Well, we have like key moments in Scripture where Jesus calls someone by name. Like I think of Mary Magdalene in the garden after the resurrection, where she doesn't recognize him until he says, Mary. He calls Zacchaeus out of the tree, right? I can't think of any others offhand, but that always, like, names are so, like, I think about when, like, my closest family, my best friends call me by name, even though, it kind of happens, it's not that unusual, but we can kind of get into this hey you habit. And when someone says my name and really means it, and there's, like, love and care behind it, like, how much that means, like, it, like, draws me out toward them.
Along that line, when he calls Saul's name, years sometime later, to get his attention, to make sure that someone knows, I am talking to you. There's no way to answer this question really, but I thought since like she's here and she's only going to be here for a few more days and she'll have the whole rest of her life to get over it. What do we think that Lazarus heard? I mean, like, what do you think he felt in that moment? Like, when, I guess he felt terrible before he died. And then maybe he didn't feel anything at all for a little while before he died. And then after he died, I guess he slept the sleep of the dead. Mm-hmm. But then he gets this wake-up call. I mean, what do you think goes on in his mind then?
I think he'd probably be pretty confused. Thinking about people who do fall into like comas or something, they remember the feeling before. And then if they wake up, God willing, they don't really remember what happened. They just remember that feeling before and then everything went black. And I would think Lazarus's experience would be similar to that, not having a medical degree or anything like that. But from what I understand from this story is Jesus fully healed him. He got up, was walking, and was probably like, shoot, I feel great. But that's what I get from it. I don't know if he questions what happens or just because of the transformation that he went through, he knows that Jesus had saved him, had brought him back from the dead. I think that's something that is unclear and that is up for interpretation. That's kind of my thought on it.
I guess part two of that question would be, wonder how it did affect Lazarus the entire rest of his life. Did did he filter every decision he made through hearing Jesus say, "Get up, come out of there," and the surprise that he probably was not in that tomb by himself. It was a communal sort of burial arrangement where maybe several people in varying states of whatever were in there, and certainly when he woke up, maybe he was horrified. I don't know, but even in the middle of the darkness and all of that smell of death and darkness of death and place of death, he heard that voice going, "Come here." And so he did what I'd have done. I think he went. So.
Well, I mentioned when we were talking about this before, like I've read some like fictionalized versions of this story, and in one of them, Lazarus was kind of like traumatized afterward. And I hadn't thought about that. The way you described it, the communal tomb, people talk about survivor's guilt, and did Lazarus have that? Like wondering, like what kind of pressure do you live up to that Jesus has saved me, and so how do I live up to that? And make something of this life that has been given as a second gift. But then the truth is, like when we really think about it, don't we all have that? That Jesus has called us, Jesus has saved us. Jesus invites us to die to our old selves and be born again to a new self. And so like we should also feel this kind of pressure, not survivor's guilt, I hope, but a calling and urging to like, well, what are we going to do with this life that we've been given? We have been set free. We got to let sin die off in the past and live into and toward eternal life in God in a whole new direction. So what do we do with that gift that's been given to us, this new life that we have in Christ? I hope that Lazarus was not traumatized, but had, like every now and then I meet someone who has this kind of rock solid faith that just fascinates me. My faith has always been characterized by questions and doubts. And that bothered me for a while, and then I kind of came to terms with it and learned how those questions and doubts actually dig me deeper into my faith and draw me nearer to God. And so I'm cool with that. That's cool. It's fine. But then sometimes I meet people who just have this sureness that is a like walking witness to others. And I wonder if Lazarus became that guy. Like, no, I know because I was dead and now I'm alive. I wonder if Lazarus was the one when Jesus talked about like, I'm going to die and then 3 days later be raised again. Lazarus was the one person who was like, I get it. I get that. I believe.
You really do get the idea that if anybody was out there sitting beside Jesus' grave for days, just waiting,
Ooh.
It would have been like, oh, yeah. But also, for me, it speaks to the value of life. We can't add a second to the end of our life. There's much about our lives that we cannot change at all. That's been decided for us. But it's this marvelous gift. And Lazarus was given the gift twice, I guess. And I'm pretty sure that he was serious about not abusing, not wasting that gift. And if I can learn anything from that passage, from Lazarus, I hope it's that, that because I've got my stuff. I carry anger with me about all the time, resentment. I've got my resentment file that I take very, very good care of. Laziness is a problem. We've all got our stuff. And if we can always, though, have that file of gratefulness, for these lives that we've been given. They're different. Some of them are more wonderful than others. But what they all do have in common is we didn't make them. So I guess how I think it unfolded is Lazarus heard Jesus when he called. He opened his eyes. He looked around, said, I'm afraid to say what he might have said. He looked around. Maybe he heard Jesus again say, come on out. And he got up from that place. He got up from that place that it's not a bad place. If once you die, that's as good a place as any. It was a respectful burial he got. clearly. People outside sad that he had died. But it wasn't his place right then. And so instead he got up and he left that place. And it gets lost on us a little bit, but if I were doing a movie about this, I would really focus on the last thing in here where Jesus said to everybody around him when that guy dressed up like a dead guy was standing in the door, and we don't know exactly like how bad he looked or smelled, but Jesus said, now go over there and unbind him, like let's bring him back to the living. And maybe one of my most important functions as both a follower of Jesus and a person who does this for a living is to make sure that I'm really careful about unbinding people and letting them go do what they need to do.
So Alex, I see you nodding, so I'm going to call you out. What do you think, like, as we think about our call as Jesus followers to help unbind others, does that make you think of something? Like, what does that look like? How do we do that?
Yeah, I've never thought of it in that sense, and that just really was like, I don't know, opened my eyes to a different side of the story, the unbinding of Lazarus, and how we are called as witnesses of Jesus Christ to meet people where they are and what they're going through in order to be Jesus' disciples and to love and to care for them. And I think unbinding people is individual and it's different for each and every person. But through the power of Christ, we are given the ability to be able to meet those people in the struggle and in the damage that they are suffering with. And something that I thought about when we were talking about what Lazarus would have done after being called from the dead. How would he have felt? What would he have done? Later, after this passage is over, it talks about the disciples and how they went out and kind of spread the word of Jesus, and it had called them to believe more in Jesus, basically, it says. And I think that is so close to our hearts as Christians because that is what we're called to do. I know for my individual self that there are many aspects where I have been called out from the dead, where I have been spiritually dead, but because of Jesus, I feel like I've been saved into new life. And as a Christian, it is important for me now to take that step as a disciple of Jesus Christ to spread the word and be a witness of his love and his power. And I think that is through being a witness on the streets, being unbinding of those who are bound in fear and bound in pain and struggle, no matter what it is. As a follower and as a disciple of Jesus Christ, I think the unbinding comes down to meeting them where they are and being willing to not kind of stand over them as being higher than them, but knowing where we came from and kneeling down with them and working through their struggles because we have the power of Jesus Christ in us and have been brought up from the dead.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what I heard you say is that maybe one of the things that we do is like we start dressing for our funeral a long time before we need to. And our job is to make sure that instead of just tolerating each of us wearing our funeral stuff, now our casket stuff, there's a difference. One of our callings is to make sure that we all have our work clothes on, our Jesus work clothes on, so we can not stop living before it's time. Yeah, good for you.
That was good.
We have a question in the comments, and I think it's a good one. Vivian wondered if Lazarus asked Jesus why. So after he's raised from the dead, if he asked Jesus why? Why'd you raise me? And I could see that. I imagine that as like a late night campfire conversation later. Like, right? Like if Lazarus, because there's a whole lot of hubbub in that moment. But maybe later if Lazarus is able to pull Jesus aside, like one-on-one, like, I just got to ask you, why? Why me? Why did you do it?
I think that's a super important question. I think in my sort of made up story of Lazarus later in their life, I think in my story, Jesus and Lazarus would have spent that moment together, and maybe Lazarus would have said, "I really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you." And I don't know, maybe they'd have put that why question off till like when they had forever to talk about it. But yeah, I mean, why Lazarus? Yeah. I don't know, Vivian.
But I like the thank you too. I mean, isn't that like, as we think about Jesus raising us from the dead in a less literal but equally important way, that thank you is the right response. Like, we can't say it enough. And the act of saying it can fuel us to live that kind of life that we're supposed to be living, to live into our gratitude for Jesus.
A part of me wants to think that maybe he didn't question it at all because he knew who he was in Jesus. After that transformation, there wasn't a doubt or a question in his mind who he belonged to or what he went through. Again, there's many different ways that we could look at this, but part of my brain wants to think that he had such a transformation in Christ and in a new life that there were no questions left. There were no doubts. He knew what his call was. He knew what he was to do because of what Jesus did for him. Now, for me, I'd be like, what the heck? But as Lazarus, maybe not.
How are we doing, team? Anything we haven't gotten into yet that one of y'all wanted to talk about? And this is the last call for you in the comments, too. If there's something we haven't hit and you're curious about, drop it in there. Let us know.
In fact, while you're thinking about that, we might mention to you that next week we'll do this again. The story that we will do then is the parable of the sower. And now I'm afraid I may embarrass myself. It's either Matthew chapter 11 or 13. It's 11, right?
It's 13.
Is it 13? Okay.
But the reason I know that, and the reason we want to talk about it, is because our sermon for First Methodist Sylva is going to be on it this Sunday, but y'all did it just this past Sunday, right?
That's correct.
And so we thought it would be cool that both our congregations have spent some time in the parable of the sower, which is, of course, in Matthew chapter 13. But since we've had some time to think about it, that it would be neat to dig into it a little more together. So
there are several kinds of soil in that story. In this story, people are the soil. In the parable, people are the soil. So I'd be grateful if you just think about which kind of soil you are in that story. So that'll maybe help when we have the conversation. And the two worst things that a preacher can do, in front of people, is get a scripture passage wrong and mess up the Lord's Prayer. And now I've done both of them, so
you can rest easy.
I've gotten that out of the way.
So we have another good question from Vivian. Do we ask God why he allows things to happen to us? Does God have something for us to do? Two good questions. I think they're separate. Do we ask God why he allows things to happen to us? Does God have something for us to do? I always think of, I really appreciate the lament psalms. Psalm 13 is one of my favorite. How long, O Lord? And of course, Jesus quotes Psalm 22 on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And if for no other reason, I feel like those psalms give us permission to ask why. Because sometimes we can't help it. I can't honestly talk to God without asking God, this is terrible. Why? But at the same time, we get the story of Job, which basically tells us that bad things do happen to good people. Job asks why a whole bunch, and at the end gets no satisfying answer except that I'm God, so why don't you sit down and be quiet about it. So I think that we can ask why, and I'm grateful we have that permission. But I think for me and my faith, I have to be open that there are often going to be times where I never get a satisfying answer as to why.
So, Vivian, Mary thinks that you're in really good biblical company to ask why, because on every other page, just about someone asks why, and very, very well they ask why. I think your second question is more important.
Do you have an answer to it?
Nope. Yeah. Sure, God has things that He wants.
Yes.
That we need to do. Yeah.
Yes, God has something to do for us to do.
That's 10 Commandment stuff, but that's also like the part where you use your creative self, your individual moment, your place on the planet to do something there.
And I think of figuring it out in each moment too. That's where I've probably said it here. I actually said it in a small group about an hour ago, earlier this morning. But that's why I like that we are followers of Christ, and I like that much better than just saying we're Christians or we're people who believe a certain thing. Like the following implies that we don't have a total sense of what God is calling us to do for our whole lives, but I'm going to do my best in every moment to figure out where Jesus is leading me and go in that direction. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for joining us for Jesus Stories.
I like that. We need to change it.
We're grateful to Alex for joining us today. That was a big step, hard stretch, and thank you for being so brave and so smart. We wish you well as you go back to seminary again. We're sorry that COVID happened and you couldn't be up here for 10 weeks, but we're grateful for the contribution you made today, and for that reason, we'll ask you to pray us out.
Yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. It's been fun. So if you'd please join me in prayer. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for today. We thank you for the opportunity to be able to gather socially distanced here together. We thank you for being able to continue to have these conversations, be able to talk through Jesus' life and ministry, and to be able to see how that is playing out today. I just ask that we continue to be disciples and followers of Jesus Christ, following in the direction that He is individually calling each and every one of us. Just thank you so much for this time, for this day, and ask for your blessings as we can continue further. Amen.
So until next week, where we'll be in Matthew 13, the parable of the sower, if you want to read ahead. And if you're a part of either of our congregations, you know that we'll be sending out information about it. But you can also come back to Facebook Live, where you found it today, next Wednesday at noon, and we'll do it again. And have fun.
And thanks to Duncan LeMay for making this happen.
Yes.
He's back in the corner. You can't see him.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you, everyone.